Inside a sealed congressional forum in Washington, D.C., Chelsea Clinton, daughter of a president, clashes with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a black woman forged by courtroom injustice, over one searing issue: should emotion ever shape national policy? Chelsea tries to discredit Jasmine's passion as noise, using composure and pedigree to stay above the fire. But within 6 minutes, Jasmine drops 3 real stories, one signed confession, and a single sentence that freezes the room. When truth speaks louder than legacy and silence becomes a weapon, what does it cost a nation to finally listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights inside the Ronald Reagan Presidential Center didn't just shine, they interrogated. Each spotlight turned the stage into a battlefield, exposing every gesture, every glance. It was the opening night of Democracy Solidarity Week, a live, uncut, nationally broadcast forum. 700 invited guests packed the room. Senators, activists, veterans, Gen Z firebrands, all silent, all waiting. Across the country, millions watched, not for policy, but for a moment. A slip, a spark, or maybe an uprising. Then she stepped in. Chelsea Clinton, former first daughter, global health advocate, board member of the Clinton Foundation, emerged first, flanked by the sheen of legacy and generations of curated applause. She walked with the ease of someone who had always been heard, who had always been introduced before she even spoke. Her eyes scanned the room like she owned it. When they landed on Jasmine Crockett, she paused, not out of recognition, but calculation. Her gaze moved on like a CEO skimming a spreadsheet. Crockett, by contrast, didn't move. She sat tall, no smile, no twitch of performance. Her stare was stone, not cold, but carved from something older, harder, forged in rooms where no cameras had ever dared enter. And then the moderator's voice cut through the hush like a scalpel. "Tonight we ask one question," he said, his voice steady but wired with tension. "What defines the next generation of leadership in America? Inherited influence or earned experience?" The words echoed as if the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. Crockett didn't blink. Clinton crossed one leg over the other, smoothing her skirt like a queen awaiting tribute. The crowd was silent, not out of respect, but anticipation. Something in the air was alive and electric, because everyone knew, in the next 90 minutes, someone's version of power was going to break. The question still hung in the air when Chelsea leaned forward, a smirk barely hidden beneath the carefully practiced calm of someone used to speaking without being challenged. She wasn't answering. She was setting the tone, her tone. She straightened her papers, cleared her throat like a professor about to correct a student, and let her voice glide across the room, soft but sharpened, with something unmistakable. "I have to say," she began, "I truly admire your energy, Congresswoman Crockett." She drew out the pause, long enough for the room to feel it, short enough to still sound civilized. "But don't you ever wonder if constant outrage loses its power?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was a precision in her tone, the kind that didn't stab, it sliced, like a velvet glove concealing a scalpel. Outrage. She said it like a flaw, a self-indulgent tic, a habit one might pick up in poor company. It wasn't a question. It was a provocation dressed in manners. She glanced toward the audience, her eyes scanning for affirmation, the way one might scan a dinner party for polite laughter after delivering a witty jab. A few obliging chuckles came from the back rows, nervous, half-hearted. But that was enough. Chelsea eased back in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed she had just taught a lesson. Her posture said, "I've done this before, and I know what I'm doing." She smiled, only with her mouth. Her eyes never softened. They stayed sharp, calculating, as if Jasmine's entire presence on that stage was a performance she had already categorized, already filed away under "too emotional to last." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the mic, didn't shuffle in her seat, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head, slowly, intentionally, as if she'd heard this script 100 times before and had already memorized every false note. Her stare didn't meet Chelsea's. It went through her, not confrontational, not theatrical, just unflinching, like someone who had been looked at wrong her whole life and had learned not to look away first. She didn't speak, but in the way she didn't react, the room felt something shift. The air tightened. The audience leaned forward, not to cheer, not to clap, but because something honest was about to happen. And deep down, everyone could feel it. Chelsea had spoken from a podium. Jasmine was sitting inside a memory. There was no need to correct Chelsea's tone. Jasmine had lived through what that tone tried to erase. And just when it seemed like the silence might stretch forever, Jasmine breathed in, slow and steady, then spoke not to counter Chelsea's words, but to unearth what those words refused to see. She looked straight at Chelsea, her voice calm and steady, stripped of anything extra. "Is this really about how I'm speaking?" she asked slowly, each word sharp and clear. "Or is this your way of saying I shouldn't be allowed to speak like this at all?" She paused, not to perform, but because the weight of her words needed space. "You hear me raise my voice and think it's unprofessional. I raise my voice because it once saved my life." The room froze. No clapping, no coughing, just a waiting stillness, like everyone had forgotten to breathe. Jasmine didn't stop. "There was a little girl I met a couple years ago. Her name was Ania. She was 9, loved puzzles and spelling bees. Super smart. One day, a boy at her school grabbed her wrist. Hard. She told a teacher. No one did anything. The next time he did it, she pulled away and yelled. And that's when the school suspended her for being disruptive. No one asked why she yelled. No one asked what happened to her. This time, Jasmine held Chelsea's gaze like she wasn't just telling a story. She was handing her a truth that couldn't be ignored. "You want to know what the principal said to Ania's mom?" Her voice dropped. He said, "Some of these kids just don't know how to handle their emotions." A low murmur ran through the room. "These kids." Jasmine let those words sit there, heavy and loud in their quietness. He wasn't talking about a little girl. He was talking about a problem, a warning sign, a disruption. And that's how a 9-year-old black girl with bruises on her wrist got sent home to think about her behavior, while no one thought to protect her. Chelsea glanced at her watch. It was small, polite, but it spoke louder than words. "This is boring. This is too much. I've heard it all before." Then came the sigh, quiet, controlled, like she wanted the audience to know. She wasn't impressed. Jasmine saw it. Everyone saw it. But she didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke lower, slower, heavier. "Last year I met a teen in Chicago. His name was Darius, 16 years old, smart, a quiet kid, straight A student, always respectful. He wore a hoodie and had a deep voice. One day in history class, he raised his hand to ask why the teacher skipped over the Tulsa massacre. He didn't yell. He didn't interrupt. He just asked. The teacher told him to wait in the hallway." Jasmine's jaw tightened slightly, but her tone stayed calm. Later, the school counselor flagged him for aggressive energy, said he might need to be watched. Darius had never been in trouble. He volunteered every week at the library, but they put a warning on his file. Why? Because his voice was too deep, because his stare was too steady, because his clothes looked like someone else's fear. She placed her hand on the table, firm, steady, like claiming ground. "I speak clearly and you call it attitude. Darius asks a question and they say he's dangerous. What exactly is the line we're supposed to walk to make other people feel safe?" Then she leaned in slightly, not to attack, but to make it impossible to look away. "Has anyone ever asked why our voices have to sound smaller than our pain?" The moderator didn't move. The cameraman, trained to stay stone still, barely remembered to breathe. Chelsea tilted her head, gave a half smile, just a twitch. The kind of smile people give when they think, "Really? We're still talking about this?" Jasmine caught it. She knew that smile. "No," she said, sharper now, not loud, just clear, and aimed right at the truth. "I know that look. I've seen it too many times. That's the look people give when they think grief is being exaggerated. But let me tell you, we don't fake this. We live with it. We carry it. We teach our kids how to survive it. She didn't blink, didn't waver. You want to talk about tone? She said, her voice tight, cutting through the air. Where was tone when Ania's mom had to teach her daughter that speaking up could get her punished? Where was tone when Darius started whispering in class so people wouldn't call him aggressive? Now she turned away from Chelsea, facing the whole room. Where was tone when I walked into a courtroom and the bailiff asked if I was the defendant? Because it didn't even cross his mind that I might be the lawyer? Now the audience reacted. Gasps. Real ones. But Jasmine didn't stop to soak it in. She wasn't here to win approval. This isn't about how we speak. It's about whether we're allowed to take up space at all. Because some people still think certain voices should know their place, should be quiet, should wait their turn. And then she turned back to Chelsea one last time. You think this is drama, she said evenly. I think people are losing their lives because too many others are too polite to feel uncomfortable. She didn't shout it. She didn't dress it up. It hit like a hammer in a silent room. And in that moment, under 1,000 watts of stage light, in front of 700 guests and millions watching from home, Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond. She shattered the idea that silence was ever neutral. The room hadn't fully recovered from Jasmine's last words when Chelsea moved again. Subtle, but deliberate. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, crossed her legs, and let out a soft, composed breath as if to reset the stage on her own terms. Her voice when it came was low and smooth, measured like marble. No one, she said, chooses the circumstances they're born into. She paused, giving the audience space to agree with her, to re-anchor themselves in something neutral. But adulthood means rising above them. Adulthood, she continued, means not letting emotion write our laws. The line was calculated, gentle on the surface but embedded with dismissal, like someone tapping the brakes during someone else's emergency. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The implication was clear. What Jasmine had delivered wasn't testimony, it was a tantrum, and in the calm stillness of Chelsea's tone, there was an insult sharper than volume. That logic lives in one voice, and emotion lives in another, and only one gets to govern. Jasmine didn't react, not with her body, but the silence she held in response was suddenly louder than any applause. Then she leaned in, just slightly, and spoke with the stillness of someone carrying too many stories to yell. You say you don't use emotion, she said, her voice stripped of performance, but that's because your voice was never taken from you. The air tightened. The words landed not like an argument, but like a fact someone had been too polite to say aloud until now. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't breathe in drama. She spoke like someone pulling truth from memory, not theory. You've never sat in a courtroom, she continued, where a 12-year-old was called hostile because he asked why his mother couldn't afford an attorney. You've never stood in a school hallway where a teacher uses the word aggressive because a student raised her hand too fast. Her tone was steady, controlled like a blade meant not to harm, but to carve open pretense. You don't use emotion? She asked, her eyes locked on Chelsea's now, unflinching. You've never needed to. The system was built to hear you even when you whisper. Now the audience wasn't just silent, they were frozen. You talk about maturity like it's the absence of feeling, Jasmine said. But for some of us, feeling is the first thing we were punished for, and the last thing we still have to fight for. Chelsea shifted, barely, but the motion was visible. A slight tightening of her mouth, a stillness in her shoulders. It wasn't that she hadn't expected a response. It was that she hadn't expected that one. Jasmine let the pause stretch, not for drama, but for space. The kind of space that had never been given to voices like hers without being clawed back. When I speak about these things, it's not to dramatize, she said, softer now, but just as firm. It's because I remember a mother in my district who was told her son was too expressive during a routine traffic stop. He ended up cuffed before she even finished a sentence. Another breath, deeper this time, but Jasmine held the tempo. You hear my voice and think it's too much, she said, but that's because you've never had to use it to stay visible, to stay alive in a system that writes you out the second you fall quiet. The stage didn't creak, but it felt like it might, because something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the power. Chelsea had tried to frame the moment as a question of professionalism. Jasmine had reframed it as a question of survival. And no one in the room, not even Chelsea, could pretend not to understand the difference anymore. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jasmine simply shifted her weight forward, anchored her elbows on the table, and let the room feel the stillness before the storm. "There's a boy named Marcus Bell," she began, steady and exact. 14 years old. He loved building things. Legos, engines, anything he could take apart and put back together better. His teachers called him shy, polite, the kind of kid who apologized for things he didn't do. There was no flourish in her tone, just truth. One afternoon, he was walking home from school when two officers stopped him near a convenience store. Something had gone wrong earlier. A window smashed, a cash drawer missing. Marcus didn't run. He didn't argue. He answered every question, and still, they took him in. Jasmine paused, her eyes scanning the rows of silent suits and uncomfortable faces. They put him in a small room. No lawyer, no parent, just a desk, a chair, and a paper covered in legal language he couldn't begin to understand. He thought it was a permission slip, something to say, "I talked to the police and now I can go." So he signed it. A few gasps echoed from the back. Jasmine's voice dropped lower. What he signed was a confession. The paper said he admitted guilt to a felony-level offense. But Marcus didn't know what the word violation meant. No one explained it. No one read it to him. They just handed him a pen. The breath in the room thinned. 3 weeks later, he was assigned a public defender who didn't have time to visit him. His school removed him from the robotics team. The local paper printed his name. And just like that, a boy who had never even gotten detention was branded for life. Jasmine's gaze never left the center of the room. "You talk about policy without emotion," she said, her voice hardening. "But let me ask you this. What kind of policy makes it legal to trick a 14-year-old into signing away his future just to make a report look clean?" From the corner of her eye, she saw Chelsea stir, an almost involuntary movement, a tightening of her jaw, a wrinkle forming on her brow. She looked poised to interrupt, to rebut, to reframe, but no one passed her the mic, because for once, no one wanted to hear the counterpoint. They wanted to hear what happened next. Absolutely. Below is the rewritten version of the scene you requested, richer in depth, emotionally sharper, visually clearer, but still fully grounded in the original structure and message. It remains entirely focused, cinematic, and visceral, without spilling into the next beat of the story. The weight of her words hadn't even settled when Jasmine inhaled, just once, slow and clean, and said the kind of sentence that didn't just silence a room. It rewired it. "We speak louder," she said, not yelling, not pleading, just stating, because the mic only starts working after someone's bled. The entire audience froze. It wasn't shock, it was recognition. That sentence didn't float like rhetoric. It thudded like a verdict. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked as someone shifted forward, not to object, but to listen harder. The kind of silence that surrounds a confession or a reckoning. Chelsea, once perched in calculated elegance, began to fold, not dramatically, but visibly. Her body language didn't scream defeat, but it whispered retreat. Her spine curled inward, like her own posture wanted to disappear from the moment. Her hand tightened on her notepad, not to write, but to grip something solid. Her gaze no longer scanned the crowd for validation. It dropped to the edge of her lap like an anchor. The control she wore like perfume all evening, measured smiles, timed sighs, flickered and fell. In the third row, a retired police chief, silver badge still pinned on his lapel out of habit or memory, reached for his glasses. He didn't cry. He didn't frown. But he took the cloth from his coat pocket, and he cleaned them anyway. Once, then again. The way men sometimes do when the story no longer matches the rules they were raised on. Jasmine didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her focus stayed forward, body still, voice even. Because she wasn't trying to win the room. She was letting the room reckon with itself. "You want to talk about tone," her silence had said seconds earlier. "Let's talk about the cost of being quiet." And without raising her voice, without moving from her chair, Jasmine Crockett had done something no stage direction could cue. She had turned every spotlight into a mirror. The echo of Jasmine's last sentence was still rippling through the room, alive in the silence, thick in the air, when Chelsea shifted forward in her chair. Her lips parted slightly as if she were preparing to retake control of the room with a well-timed rebuttal, a polished line about pragmatism, about the need for balance over passion. Her index finger tapped once on the edge of the microphone, ready to lean in. But before a syllable could escape, the moderator held up one palm, no sound, no smile, just a firm gesture of restraint. The meaning was unmistakable. Let her speak. Chelsea hesitated. That tiny pause, the first she hadn't chosen, clutched the atmosphere tighter. She leaned back slowly, not in surrender, in calculation. But it was already too late. Her rhythm had cracked. The moment wasn't hers anymore. Jasmine didn't rush. She let the stillness linger for a second longer until it wrapped around her words like flint around fire. Then, with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed none of this, because she had lived all of it, she said, "Some people grow up in the Oval Office. Some grow up in the interrogation room." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It just landed, cold and clean, like truth tends to do when it's not asking for permission. And the room detonated in silence. Not a word, not a breath. Just the slow internal combustion of 700 minds realizing what had just been laid bare. The sentence hit like a siren in a tunnel, short, impossible to ignore, and echoing off every surface. Chelsea's mouth stayed open for a half-second too long, her intended interjection frozen in her throat. She closed it slowly, a shallow gulp marking the moment her throat tightened. The corner of her lip, where that faint, bemused smirk had lived just minutes ago, flattened into a thin, neutral line. Her eyes blinked, once, then again. And finally, for the first time that evening, she looked unsure of where to look. The phrase had sliced clean through legacy, through pedigree, through every polished line on her prep sheet. Jasmine hadn't said it with malice. She hadn't said it to shock. She had said it like someone reciting a street address she never got to forget. Across the room, a young woman, mid-20s, suit jacket too big for her shoulders, eyes locked on Jasmine, clutched her notebook a little tighter. Not because she needed to remember the quote, because something in her body told her she already would. For a long time. Jasmine let the silence expand again, not to savor the moment, but to give it weight, to let the contrast sit. She could have gone on. She didn't, because some truths don't need follow-up. They just need space. And in that space, something unspoken shifted in the room. Not allegiance, not applause, respect. The kind that couldn't be argued down. The kind that didn't belong to whoever had the next mic. It belonged to whoever just told the truth, without blinking. The air hadn't moved. Not really. And yet it felt heavier now, charged with something unseen but undeniable. You could sense it in the way people sat up straighter, in the way even the cameras seemed to pull in tighter, instinctively zooming toward the stillest figure in the room, Chelsea. Not because she commanded it, but because the balance had tipped. Jasmine's words, Oval Office versus interrogation room, still clung to the walls like smoke after an explosion. And when Chelsea finally spoke, her voice didn't carry the confidence it once did. I've never looked at it that way, she said quietly, almost to herself. It wasn't a concession, not yet, but it wasn't deflection either. It was the voice of someone realizing the floor beneath their argument might not be as solid as they thought. Her tone cracked at the edges, not from emotion, but from unfamiliarity. She was stepping into terrain she hadn't studied for. No footnotes, no prepared counterpoints, just the echo of a truth she couldn't refute. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod or soften. She didn't extend a branch of comfort or gratitude or polite forgiveness. She let the pause stretch like a taut wire, tension humming through the silence. Then her voice, low, controlled, and unshakably precise, cut clean through it. "Then don't lecture me about tone," she said, her eyes never leaving Chelsea's. Not when you've never lived inside forced silence. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They pressed down. Every syllable landed with surgical weight, not shouted but anchored, spoken like someone who had been forced too many times to bite her tongue while the world around her spoke freely. It wasn't just about Chelsea anymore. It was about everyone who had ever called volume a problem, but never asked what made the voice grow loud in the first place. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her hands rested flat on the table, as steady as her breath. Her voice didn't break. That was the point. She had broken enough times in rooms where nobody noticed, and she had no interest in granting this room a breakdown to consume. Across the audience, a dozen expressions shifted. Not dramatically, not in unison, but enough to register the shift. A black woman near the back wiped at her cheek with her sleeve, not drawing attention, just grounding herself. A college-aged man near the front, head once cocked skeptically, now stared like a man watching a puzzle complete itself all at once. Chelsea blinked hard. Her jaw worked slightly, as if forming a sentence she knew would sound hollow. Her fingers tightened around her pen. That once effortless posture, casual superiority wrapped in polish, was gone now. She looked for the first time like someone who wasn't sure if the ground rules of the conversation still belonged to her. But Jasmine hadn't come for sympathy. She had come for air, real air, and truth had been her oxygen. I didn't grow up learning how to debate with polished smiles, she continued. I grew up learning how to read a room before I spoke, how to measure my voice so I wouldn't get labeled angry before I even opened my mouth. No one moved. You want to know what shapes tone? She asked, the rhetorical sharp as steel. Try sitting in a waiting room while your mother negotiates with a public defender who calls you him 3 times before realizing you're her daughter. Try being told to speak softer so you seem safer, even when you're the one in danger. Her eyes never left Chelsea, but her words widened, spoke past her, toward the room itself, to every nodding head, to every held breath. Tone isn't something we choose. It's something we carry. You call it performance. I call it survival. Chelsea exhaled through her nose. A long, deliberate breath. Not angry, not indifferent. Something closer to shaken. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not because she wanted to dominate, but because this was the first time the door had been forced open wide enough to speak plainly. You've never had to choose between being heard and being safe, she said. You've never walked into a job interview and seen the glance at your braids before the handshake. You've never had your passion recategorized as instability just because you dared to speak up after being ignored. The words stacked like bricks, one on top of the other, building something unignorable, something weight-bearing. No metaphor, no filter. I'm not angry at your privilege, she said. I'm angry that your comfort depends on my silence. That stopped everything. Even the cameraman shifted, subtly. Even the moderator, for all their neutrality, bowed their head just slightly. You don't hear how quiet it's been for us, because the silence has never been aimed at you, Jasmine added, her voice softer now, but no less exact. Her breathing remained measured, but her heart was working overtime behind the restraint. She wasn't just speaking, she was excavating, digging out decades of being told to moderate, to be reasonable, to temper the truth so the room wouldn't flinch. Well, the room had flinched, and now it had no choice but to stay still and listen. Don't talk to me about adulthood, she continued, her gaze direct and unwavering. Not when the world decided I was an adult the second I said no too loudly, or the moment I wore the wrong expression near a badge, or when I walked home alone and a man in uniform slowed down his car just to ask a question. The tension in the room didn't dissolve, it deepened, the kind of silence that no longer needed volume to feel loud. Chelsea opened her mouth, then closed it. The pen in her hand now looked less like a tool and more like an anchor, one she wasn't sure how to drop anymore. Jasmine leaned back finally, but her presence didn't retreat. It lingered in the air like a storm refusing to pass. You say adults shouldn't use emotion to shape policy, she said, almost contemplative. But maybe that's because emotions never shaped yours. Maybe the system already fits you so neatly, you never had to feel your way through its cracks. She let that sit. A long breath. Then, we don't use emotion to build our arguments. We use it to prove we exist. Then finally Jasmine's gaze shifted. Away from Chelsea, toward the moderator, toward the room. She didn't ask for validation. She didn't need applause. She had already won something far more lasting, silence that wasn't indifferent. It was listening, and that was everything. The room hadn't moved, but the world had. And before anyone could exhale or gather their scattered thoughts, the moment had already begun to ripple through phones, screens, whispers, and headlines. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak. She detonated the lie that silence was ever neutral. And the echo of her words was already on the march. Within 20 minutes, clips of the confrontation were being clipped, captioned, and shared faster than algorithms could react. The moment where Chelsea Clinton lowered her eyes and Jasmine looked directly into the storm without blinking, froze in frame, overlaid with a quote now igniting social feeds like a fuse. "Don't lecture me about tone when you've never lived inside forced silence." It was quoted, paraphrased, rewritten, but the meaning never changed. The Guardian's homepage read, "Crockett shuts down Chelsea Clinton with the truth and the internet listens." The New York Times, often hesitant with headlines, offered no ambiguity this time. Jasmine Crockett's words stunned nation, a lesson in power, pain, and presence. But it wasn't just the mainstream. Civil rights pages, teacher forums, veteran blogs, and even conservative platforms couldn't ignore it. One commentator, an unlikely voice on a right-leaning podcast, whispered, "I don't agree with her politics, but that woman made me shut up and think." It was a reluctant respect, but it was real. The kind that says something has cracked through the armor. Churches projected her words on Sunday morning behind pulpits, once too polite to say race. In one black church in Birmingham, a young deacon read the quote about microphones only working after blood is spilled before his sermon, and grown men nodded through tears. Teachers printed the transcript for discussion. A middle school debate coach in Detroit canceled his lesson plan to let his students analyze Jasmine's line. "We don't perform grief, we carry it." One student, 12 years old, wrote on the board, "This is how my mom talks when the police are behind her." No one erased it. On a quiet campus quad in North Carolina, a group of first-year law students gathered around a laptop, replaying Jasmine's testimony frame by frame. One of them whispered, "This wasn't just a hearing, it was history," and she rewrote it in real time. They didn't need a textbook. They had a moment, and it was breathing. The headlines multiplied. "When justice sounds like fire, Crockett's words go global." Chelsea Clinton left speechless after Crockett's verbal masterclass. Some people grow up in the Oval Office, some in interrogation rooms. That sentence just cracked America open. The speech became more than political. It became personal. It wasn't policy that Jasmine had offered. It was memory forged in friction. She'd spoken the quiet part out loud, on camera, under lights, with full awareness that power was in the room. And she didn't flinch. In suburban book clubs, mothers sat in silence after reading her words, wondering how many times they'd told their own kids to use the right tone without asking why their tone changed to begin with. In one library in St. Louis, a young woman left a post-it note on the community board next to a copy of The Fire Next Time. It read, "Jasmine Crockett just lit a match. Don't look away." Even the silence of those who disagreed was telling. Conservative news anchors, eager to pivot, found themselves rerunning the clip, not because they supported it, but because it was unignorable. One panelist tried to minimize it, mumbling, "Well, she's emotional." But even that word rang hollow now. The audience didn't laugh. They'd heard what she said, and something about it stayed. It stayed because it wasn't just a story of being interrupted. It was the story of being born into interruption. And in that telling, Jasmine had cracked something deeper. The lie that neutrality is noble. The lie that tone can be separated from trauma. The lie that pain should only be persuasive if it's polite. On TikTok, a clip of Jasmine's calm stare, the one that cut through Chelsea like glass through water, was remixed with Nina Simone's "Ain't Got No, I Got Life." It went viral in hours. College girls mimed her words. Mothers stitched stories of their own moments of erasure. Veterans, men who hadn't cried since Desert Storm, commented, "That's the kind of leadership we need." Some tried to spin it as a gotcha moment, but it wasn't. Jasmine hadn't won in the traditional sense. She hadn't dunked. She hadn't grandstanded. What she did was more dangerous. She named what others refused to see. She called the quiet by its name, and now the nation was listening. In high schools across Texas, debate coaches printed her transcript alongside Martin Luther King and Baldwin. One teacher asked, "What makes Jasmine's argument so effective?" A student in the back, quiet until now, raised her hand and said, "Because it wasn't an argument. It was a memory that hurt too much to lie about." Even late-night hosts, usually cynical, paused the punchlines. One looked into the camera and said, "No joke here. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak truth to power, she made power feel truth for once." By day 3, major newspapers followed up. Interviews with educators, activists, and mental health workers filled segments. NPR ran a special, "The Politics of Presence," when a black woman refuses to whisper. And through it all, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't post a victory lap. She didn't retweet the praise. Because it wasn't about her, it was about all the time she hadn't been allowed to speak. And now that the world had listened, it wasn't applause she needed. It was change. The noise faded, but the weight remained. Days after the media storm, the nation buzzed with interpretations, debates, and reenactments of a moment that refused to be diluted. But away from the screens, the applause, and the glare of public validation, something quieter, something far more human, was taking shape. It wasn't on a stage. There were no podiums, no cameras, no microphones clipped to lapels. Just a closed classroom in D.C., white walls and scuffed tile floors, filled with 24 Gen Z students from different states, backgrounds, and lives. The air buzzed with nerves, not from fame, but from history walking through the door. Jasmine Crockett arrived first. No entourage, just a black notebook in one hand and a dry erase marker in the other. She scanned the room with practiced calm, offered a slight nod to the students, then walked slowly toward the whiteboard, like she wasn't about to speak. But listen. The door opened behind her. Chelsea Clinton stepped in, quieter than the students expected. She didn't wear political polish today. No suit jacket, no press team, just denim, flats, and the look of someone who had come to understand that not every moment needed a podium to feel monumental. For a breathless moment, no one moved. No moderator introduced them. No one clapped. The room was already too full of silence charged with history. This was not a rematch. This wasn't theater. This was reconciliation, on terms set by those who had inherited the cost. Jasmine turned to the board and uncapped the marker. Her handwriting was sharp, deliberate, like every letter was a wound stitched with intent. "Don't speak louder, speak truer." She underlined it once. Then she stepped back. No speech, no preamble, just silence thick enough to demand reflection. Chelsea stood still for a moment longer. Then she walked forward and stood beside Jasmine. Not across from her, not opposite, beside. She looked at the words on the board. Her gaze lingered there. Not like someone analyzing a quote, but like someone letting it hit where it needed to. Then without a word, she reached for the marker. She didn't edit, didn't erase. She signed underneath. So did Jasmine. No speeches, no cameras, no selfies. They handed the marker to the first student in the circle and stepped back. And that's when something changed. Because this wasn't about headlines now. It was about inheritance. What we pass on, what we undo, what we learn too late. One student, no older than 19, stood and spoke. "I watched that whole hearing 3 times, she said, voice tight, "and I realized no one's ever told me it was okay to be angry and intelligent. I thought I had to pick." Another student, a young man from Atlanta with sharp eyes and a hesitant tone, raised his hand next. "My brother was arrested for resisting when he didn't move fast enough during a stop," he said. "He was quiet, still got cuffed. I didn't know what to do. But then I saw you, Congresswoman, and I realized maybe my voice is allowed to be something." Chelsea listened, every word. No interruptions, her hands folded in her lap like someone attending a vigil. not a panel. She didn't speak until the fourth or fifth student had finished, and even then, it wasn't defense. It wasn't apology. It was something closer to confession. I grew up thinking empathy was enough, she said, slowly. But empathy without exposure can become assumption, and assumptions don't just mislead, they erase. The room didn't clap. It wasn't that kind of space. But they heard her. Jasmine nodded slightly, once. Not forgiveness, not approval, recognition of a truth finally spoken without armor. Another student stood, her arms crossed, not with defiance, but with a kind of practiced self-protection. My grandma never raised her voice, and she said, not because she didn't want to, because she didn't think it would matter. But I think if she heard that hearing, she would have stood. She looked at Jasmine directly. Thank you for standing. Loud. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her silence held gratitude and gravity all at once. Then a student near the back, barely audible, asked the question no one else had dared. Was it hard? He asked. Saying all that to someone like her? The room froze. Chelsea blinked slowly, and Jasmine, steady as stone, answered. It wasn't hard, she said. It was heavy. There's a difference. I didn't say it to win. I said it so the next girl with too much truth in her throat wouldn't be told to lower her voice just to survive the day. The boy nodded. His lips didn't move, but his eyes did. Another truth passed like a current through the room, and with that, Jasmine closed her notebook. Chelsea gathered her things. No signature, no soundbite, just a moment marked in ink on a whiteboard, and something deeper etched in each student's mind. Not a debate, not a detente, a reckoning, and a handing over of the mic. The two women left together, but this time, they didn't walk in front of the students. They walked behind. They didn't speak as they left the room. No cameras followed, no commemorative plaque was unveiled. But behind them, 24 students sat still, their eyes fixed on the words left on the board. Unpolished, unfiltered, unforgotten. Don't speak louder, speak truer. It echoed. Not because it rhymed, not because it sounded like something tweetable, but because for the first time in that room, maybe the first time in their lives, truth didn't arrive dressed in polish. It arrived dressed in pain, and the room didn't turn away. A few minutes later, the door clicked shut behind them, and silence took hold. Not the uncomfortable kind, not the fearful kind, the kind that comes when something has ended, but its echo has only just begun. Somewhere on some intern's schedule sheet, this session would be logged as Private Roundtable, Youth Policy Engagement. But that's not what it was. It was an untelevised confrontation between two histories. One backed by privilege, the other by survival. And in the middle of it all stood the kind of honesty that can't be scripted. Later that night, in a quiet office lined with news clippings and old photographs, a journalist reviewed her notes for a retrospective column. She paused, then typed a single line at the top of the page, just above the headline space, not for print, just for her. One carried a name, one carried memory, but the one who made the room think twice walked in with the truth. The words landed heavy in her chest, not because they were clever, but because they were undeniable. Chelsea Clinton had inherited a lineage, one soaked in power, wrapped in policy, and shielded by legacy. Her surname could unlock rooms. It could buffer mistakes. It gave her the benefit of being presumed composed, even when she stumbled. Jasmine Crockett carried something else. Not a brand, a burden, not a name etched in marble, but names engraved on tombstones. She didn't walk into that room with talking points. She walked in with scars. Not visible ones, but the kind you carry in your voice when you've been silenced too many times to count. The kind that make your tone sharper, your breath steadier, your presence unavoidable. That's why the room had shifted. Not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to lower her truth. And the room felt it. Not immediately, not in applause, but in the way the students didn't check their phones, in the way the silence after each sentence wasn't empty, but full. Full of things they had never said out loud, full of stories they'd never known they were allowed to tell. Jasmine hadn't come to be admired, or celebrated, or even thanked. She came to shatter the illusion that the only voices worth hearing are the ones that don't shake. And that's what she did. Chelsea, to her credit, didn't try to retake the spotlight. She didn't interrupt. She didn't pivot. She didn't sanitize. She listened. For real. Maybe for the first time. And in that listening, raw, unscripted, exposed, something changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. The shift wasn't seismic, it was cellular. A single fiber in the fabric of generational misunderstanding had been pulled loose, not to unravel, but to be rewoven. Outside the building, the night moved on without fanfare. No paparazzi, no protests, no dramatic applause. Just two women walking toward their separate cars beneath the same unremarkable sky. But inside, in that closed room that would never make the news, the temperature had changed forever. In the days that followed, students began quoting Jasmine in quiet posts and anonymous essays. Churches played snippets of her testimony beneath gospel chords. College dorms turned her phrases into conversation starters. And somewhere in the Midwest, a social studies teacher erased a lesson plan and replaced it with, "Today we're going to talk about the sound of truth." Not the tone, the sound. It didn't matter whether they agreed with her politics. It didn't matter whether they even knew her name the week before. They remembered how she made them feel, like something true had just been said out loud, and no one could pretend otherwise. There are moments that change policies, others that shift public opinion, and then there are moments that change people. Jasmine Crockett didn't win a debate that day. She cracked something open. And in doing so, she proved a truth no panel could refute. That legacy might open doors, but only lived experience knows what the floor feels like. That names carry power, but memories carry weight. And when those two collide in the same room, only truth survives the silence that follows. One carried a name, one carried memory. But the one who made the room think again walked in with truth. And as the story faded from front-page headlines into the long memory of public conscience, something deeper remained, unseen but undeniable. Because what Jasmine left behind wasn't a speech. It wasn't even a victory. It was a wound made visible, a fracture in the polished floor of polite conversation that could no longer be ignored. That's where the real lesson lived. It wasn't in the silence she broke. It was in the silence she revealed. The one that had existed long before that room. In classrooms where Black children learned to lower their voices to survive. In courtrooms where justice was translated through accents. In job interviews where names on a resume decided a person's worth before a single word was spoken. It was the silence that crept in when a mother chose a soft tone over a sharp truth, afraid her honesty might make her child unhireable, unpromotable, uninvited. Jasmine didn't bring a new problem to the surface. She brought old pain to light, pain that had been packaged in professionalism, buried under data, whitewashed into issues. And she forced the room to confront it, not with rage, but with clarity, not with accusation, but with exposure. Her power wasn't in how loud she spoke. It was in how unmistakably human she made injustice feel. This wasn't about Chelsea Clinton. It never was. It was about the people who grew up thinking justice sounded like calm voices and polished grammar, while never wondering why the calmest voices in the room were the ones who'd never been silenced. It was about the ones who call for civility when confronted with raw memory, the ones who say tone matters, but have never had their stories twisted by the tone of someone else's comfort. Because the truth is, power fears emotion when that emotion is earned. What Jasmine taught, without a lecture, without a closing statement, is that some voices rise not because they want to dominate, but because they were never given space to simply exist. That sometimes clarity doesn't come dressed in neutrality. It comes wearing a scar, and those scars speak. The lesson then is not to speak softer. It is to listen harder. Not to flinch when someone tells you what it costs them to stand in that room. Not to shrink when pain refuses to be dressed up. Not to mistake raw honesty for hostility or quiet survival for passivity. But to recognize that dignity doesn't always whisper, it sometimes demands. The human truth Jasmine carved into that room, into every eye that watched, into every heart that stayed silent because it was easier, was this. The world does not become more just by asking the wounded to whisper. It becomes just when the comfortable learn to hear the volume of pain without demanding it be polite. And that is not a theory. It is not a metaphor. It is a 9-year-old girl suspended for screaming when her wrist was bruised. It is a 16-year-old boy flagged for raising his hand in class. It is a 14-year-old who signed a confession because no one told him what violation meant. It is a congresswoman who walked into a courtroom and was assumed to be the defendant. It is the everyday burden of translating your very presence into something acceptable when your presence was never the problem. This is the lesson. That lived experience is not a liability, it's the evidence. That memory is not noise, it's the witness. And that if justice cannot bear to hear the truth when it is spoken with feeling, then maybe it isn't justice at all, just a quieter version of control. In the days after that hearing, the story didn't just echo in newsrooms. It echoed in churches, in lecture halls, in dorm rooms and dining tables, and whispered conversations between parents and children who finally had the language to ask, "Have you ever felt that way too?" And maybe that's where the healing starts. Not in a headline, but in a question, not in applause, but in understanding. Because what Jasmine did, what she refused to not do, was demand that people stop asking her to make her truth smaller just so they could keep pretending it wasn't real. And in doing so, she reminded us all, some people walk into a room with a last name. Others walk in carrying generations of silence. But the ones who leave that room forever changed are the ones who learn that truth doesn't need permission to be loud. It just needs space to be heard. And when that space is finally made, when the air is thick with memory and no one dares to interrupt, and silence no longer protects the powerful but reveals their indifference, something sacred happens. Justice begins to breathe. Not perfectly, not easily, but fully. And that, in the end, is what Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a takedown, not a viral moment, but a new frequency. One that doesn't ask, "Can you say that more gently?" but instead demands, "Why did we need it gentler in the first place?" That is the lesson. That is the reckoning. And that is the beginning of change. But truth by itself is never enough, because the world doesn't change when someone hears the truth. It changes only when enough people refuse to let it be forgotten. And in the hours after Jasmine's words stopped echoing through that panel room, after the audience stood in stunned silence and the cameras slowly shut off, there was a decision to be made. Not by her, by us. What do we do when someone hands us their truth? Not as a gift, but as a burden we helped build. You could feel it, the shift, not in Washington, not in the headlines, but in the quiet, necessary places where power has always hoped no one would look. In the schools that write up little black girls for attitude while ignoring bruises on their arms. In the courtrooms where kids sign plea deals they don't understand because no one ever explained that violation is not the same thing as guilt. In the police precincts where a raised eyebrow from the wrong teenager becomes a behavioral report. These aren't moments, they're patterns. And patterns, when left unchecked, become policies. That's what Jasmine exposed. Not just pain, not just bias. She exposed the scaffolding, the silent machinery that runs beneath every institution, pretending to be neutral. And now we're here, standing at the edge of the aftershock. So this is the part where you don't get to go back to comfort. You don't get to say, "Powerful speech," and move on with your day. You don't get to bookmark the video and tell yourself awareness is action. You don't get to quote her line about speaking louder without asking yourself why the microphone was off in the first place. You don't get to praise her conviction unless you're willing to carry even a fraction of the consequences that conviction brings. Because Jasmine didn't raise her voice for applause. She raised it because that's what happens when the volume of injustice outweighs the silence of policy. If you're asking, what can I do? Start with this. Understand that silence is not safety. It is strategy, and it never works in your favor unless you're the one the system was built to protect. Start by listening, not to what makes you feel good, to what makes you answerable. Then ask harder questions. Who are the Marcus Bells in your city, your school district, your courtroom? How many of them signed away their futures before they could legally rent a movie, just because no one thought they needed to understand the language of the law? How many Aeneas were labeled difficult before anyone thought to ask them what happened? And how many Dariuses lowered their voices until they forgot what it felt like to speak freely? You don't need a title to make change. You need a threshold. A point where you decide that inaction costs more than courage. That moment is now. Volunteer at schools where suspension is the default. Join court monitoring groups where judges assume restless means guilty. Show up at school board meetings and ask why dress codes punish distracting hair, but not discriminatory comments. Fund legal aid clinics. Support trauma-informed education. Fight for restorative justice programs that treat pain like something to heal, not punish. And if you're in a position of privilege, if your skin, your salary, your zip code have given you the benefit of the doubt more times than you can count, then your job isn't just to listen, your job is to leverage. Leverage that access, that comfort, that safety. Make the phone call someone else would be arrested for making. Demand transparency someone else would be punished for requesting. Use the mic someone else would be denied. Be clear, this is not charity, it's restitution. Because Jasmine didn't ask for pity, she didn't ask for permission, she asked for accountability. And accountability, real accountability, is not poetic. It's procedural. It's written into budget lines. It's enforced by votes. It's sustained through exhaustion. And yes, it's often met with resistance. People will call it divisive. They'll call it dramatic. They'll say not everything is about race. They'll accuse you of being ungrateful, of being angry, of being unreasonable. But when the system is built to mute some voices, volume becomes a form of survival. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Let them sit in that discomfort, because comfort never dismantled a single unjust policy. Let them flinch. Let them shift in their seats. Let them lower their eyes. Because that's what Jasmine had to endure just to be heard. 1,000 little dismissals dressed as decorum. 1,000 smirks disguised as debate. But she still showed up, still sat in that seat, still told the truth, knowing full well that the room wasn't built to receive it. That's courage. But it's not her burden alone anymore. Now it's yours. So don't wait for the next Jasmine to walk into the room and bear the weight of silence again. Be the one who breaks it. Be the one who stops asking for better tone and starts demanding better laws. We are not at the end of the story. We are standing in the part where it can finally turn. But only if enough people do more than clap. Only if enough people get louder than the lie. Because truth is only dangerous when it threatens the system that relies on forgetting. And Jasmine Crockett just made forgetting impossible. So don't you dare look away now. But even now, even after all the lights have dimmed and the headlines have faded from the front page, there's one more thing left to say. Change doesn't begin in the moment someone speaks. It begins in what people choose to do when no one is watching. And if Jasmine Crockett taught us anything, it's this. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the consequence of convenience. It's what happens when people with the power to act decide that comfort is more valuable than justice. But she showed us the opposite. That discomfort can be a form of truth-telling. That awkwardness, tension, conflict, these aren't the enemy. They're the evidence that something honest is finally happening. What Jasmine did in that room wasn't just about confronting Chelsea Clinton. It was about confronting a system that teaches people to fear the sound of a voice that doesn't flatter them. A voice that doesn't wait for permission. A voice that carries not just opinion, but memory, history, survival. She didn't ask to be understood. She asked to be witnessed. And now that we've witnessed it, the next question is, what will we do with that witness? Because you don't get to unsee it. You don't get to forget the way Chelsea's voice cracked when she realized she wasn't debating a theory. She was standing in the path of someone's lived reality. You don't get to forget the way Jasmine's tone didn't rise. It deepened. The way it didn't perform, it cut. And you definitely don't get to forget the way a single sentence. You don't get to teach me about tone when you've never lived through forced silence. Wasn't just a comeback. It was a reclaiming. It was an act of survival, weaponized into clarity. That kind of clarity doesn't disappear when the room clears out. It lingers. It follows you home. It sits with you when you scroll past another report about a teenager suspended for talking back, when all he did was ask a question. It echoes when you hear someone say, well, maybe she should have been more polite, and realize they've confused dignity with obedience. It reminds you that somewhere, right now, a child is being taught not how to think, but how to shrink. And unless we step into that pattern and interrupt it, we become part of it. So the call isn't just to act, it's to remain accountable after the applause stops. It's to show up for school board elections that no one thinks are sexy. It's to read policy when it's boring, because policy is where injustice hides. It's to talk to your kids, your coworkers, your pastors, your principals, not about tone, but about trauma, equity, presence, power, and the long echoes of history that still shape every hallway a child walks down. You want to honor Jasmine's moment? Then build something that outlives it, not a mural, not a quote on a poster, but a shift in how we see who belongs in rooms, in how we listen when someone's voice makes us uncomfortable, in how we stop demanding that pain be expressed quietly in order to be heard legitimately. Because what Jasmine Crockett proved isn't just that truth can be weaponized, it's that truth can be architectural. It can build pressure, it can reshape rooms, it can crack glass that was never meant to break. And when that happens, when the cracks finally start to show in systems that once felt untouchable, you don't get to ask for repairs. You get to ask for redesign. So redesign with us, rewrite the questions, rethink what it means to speak professionally, reclaim the spaces that taught you silence was safer. Because if we've learned anything from the story that just unfolded, it's that justice doesn't wear a suit. Sometimes it walks in wearing pain like armor. Sometimes it doesn't raise its voice because it's angry. It raises its voice because it has no other way to survive. And when that voice finally breaks through, the most dangerous thing we can do is treat it like a moment, because it was never a moment. It was a beginning. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.